The new CEO told me I was too old and needed to step aside for fresh blood. What he didn't know was that I owned 60% of the company he thought he was running. By the time I finished speaking, half his management team was updating their resumes, and the other half was begging to keep their jobs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have seen the warning signs the moment Marcus Thornfield walked into our Seattle headquarters that gray October morning. His designer's suit probably cost more than most of our employees made in a month, and his smile had that practiced quality of someone who'd perfected the art of looking sincere while calculating profit margins. At 58, I'd been with Cascade Technologies long enough to recognize ambition when it strutted through our glass doors, but I'd never encountered the particular brand of arrogance that Marcus brought with him. My name is Eleanor Chen, though everyone at the company had called me Ellie for the past 23 years. I'd started as a junior software developer fresh out of the University of Washington, back when our office was 3 cramped rooms above a coffee shop in Pioneer Square, and our biggest client was a local accounting firm that needed help digitizing their filing system. Those were different times, when innovation meant staying up until 3 in the morning debugging code and celebrating breakthroughs with pizza and cheap beer. Now Cascade Technologies occupied 4 floors of a gleaming tower overlooking Elliott Bay, with satellite offices in Portland, San Francisco, and Austin. We'd grown from that scrappy startup into a major player in enterprise software solutions, with annual revenues pushing $200 million. But growth, I'd learned, sometimes attracted the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of people. Marcus had been brought in by the board of directors as part of what they called a strategic restructuring initiative. The previous CEO, David Morrison, had built the company alongside the original founders, but had decided to step down to spend more time with his family. David was old school, the kind of leader who knew every employee's name and remembered their kids' birthdays. Under his leadership, we'd maintained what everyone agreed was a unique company culture, one that valued experience alongside innovation, where seasoned developers worked alongside fresh graduates in an atmosphere of mutual respect. That culture began to shift the moment Marcus took over the corner office. His first company-wide meeting should have been my warning. He stood at the front of our main conference room, his PowerPoint presentation already loaded with buzzwords like synergy, optimization, and disruptive innovation. The slide that caught my attention, though, was titled Workforce Revitalization Strategy. Even from my seat in the back row, I could see what was coming. The technology sector moves at lightning speed, Marcus announced, his voice carrying that particular confidence that comes with an MBA from Wharton and a track record of corporate acquisitions. To stay competitive, we need fresh perspectives, cutting-edge thinking, and the kind of energy that can only come from digital natives who've grown up breathing this industry. I glanced around the room at my colleagues, many of whom had been with the company for over a decade. Sarah Kim, our head of quality assurance, had been instrumental in developing our flagship security protocols. Robert Martinez from Systems Architecture had designed the infrastructure that allowed us to scale from a regional player to a national presence. Jennifer Walsh in project management had successfully overseen the integration of 3 major acquisitions without losing a single client. All of them were over 40. All of them were suddenly looking uncomfortable. Marcus continued his presentation, talking about the need to attract millennial and Gen Z talent, about creating a workplace that reflected the demographic of our user base, about ensuring that our development teams had the cultural fluency to create products for the modern market. Everything he said sounded reasonable on the surface, but there was an undercurrent that made my stomach tighten with each slide. Change is never easy, he said, advancing to a slide about performance optimization and workforce efficiency. But companies that fail to evolve get left behind. We're going to make some difficult decisions over the next few months, but I'm confident that the team we build will be stronger, more agile, and more innovative than ever before. After the meeting, I lingered in the hallway, watching my colleagues file past with expressions ranging from confused to worried. Sarah caught my eye and shook her head slightly. She'd been in tech long enough to recognize corporate speak when she heard it. "What do you think that was really about?" asked Jennifer, falling into step beside me as we walked back toward our respective offices. "I think," I said carefully, "that we just got told we're too old without anyone actually saying the words. The changes started small, the way they always do when someone wants to avoid the appearance of discrimination. Marcus instituted what he called innovation workshops, where teams would be encouraged to brainstorm disruptive solutions to industry challenges. Participation wasn't mandatory, he emphasized, but the sessions were scheduled during times when employees with families would find it difficult to attend. Evening meetings, weekend brainstorming sessions, early morning strategy discussions that started before most school-age children were even awake. I watched as younger employees eagerly signed up for these sessions, seeing them as opportunities to showcase their creativity and dedication. Meanwhile, experienced team members like Sarah, who needed to pick up her daughter from daycare, and Robert, who coached his son's soccer team on weekends, found themselves gradually excluded from what Marcus positioned as the company's most important strategic initiatives. The messaging was subtle but consistent. Innovation required availability. Dedication meant flexibility. The future belonged to those willing to sacrifice everything for the company's success. It was a philosophy that systematically favored young single employees over those with family obligations or personal commitments outside of work. Within 6 weeks of Marcus taking over, the first round of layoffs was announced. They were presented as part of a strategic realignment, a necessary step to position the company for aggressive growth in emerging markets. The employees selected for termination were all over 50, all with significant tenure, and all with compensation packages that reflected their years of experience and contribution. "We're grateful for their service," Marcus announced during the company meeting, where the departures were revealed. "But we need to ensure that our resources are allocated toward building the team of the future." David Morrison, our former CEO, had always maintained an open-door policy. Any employee could schedule time to discuss concerns, ideas, or career development. Marcus implemented what he called structured communication protocols. Meetings had to be scheduled through his assistant, with a clear agenda submitted in advance. Casual conversations were discouraged in favor of formal reporting structures. The easy accessibility that had been one of Cascade's defining characteristics disappeared virtually overnight. I requested a meeting with Marcus 3 weeks after the first round of layoffs. His assistant, a recent college graduate named Ashley who seemed to worship Marcus with the fervor of someone who'd never worked for a bad boss, scheduled me for a 15-minute slot on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus's office had been completely redecorated since David's departure. Gone were the family photos, the collection of software industry awards, and the comfortable seating area where David used to hold informal discussions. In their place, Marcus had
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Installed a minimalist workspace with a standing desk, abstract art, and a collection of business books arranged with the precision of a museum display. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the uncomfortable metal chairs positioned across from his desk. "I understand you wanted to discuss something." "I'm concerned about the direction we're heading," I said directly. "We're losing institutional knowledge with every departure. Some of the people we've let go were instrumental in building the systems that make this company profitable." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression patient but dismissive. "I understand that change can be difficult, especially for employees who've been here for a long time. But we need to think strategically about our human capital allocation." Human capital allocation? As if people were simply resources to be optimized rather than individuals with families, mortgages, and decades of expertise. "Sarah Kim alone has prevented 3 major security breaches over the past 5 years, I continued. "Robert Martinez designed the architecture that handles 90% of our client processing. These aren't just employees, Marcus. They're the foundation of our technical infrastructure. And I appreciate their contributions," Marcus replied smoothly. "But we need to ask ourselves whether maintaining expensive legacy resources is the best use of our budget when we could hire 3 recent graduates for the cost of 1 senior developer." Legacy resources. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. These were people who had built their careers at Cascade, who had contributed to every major success the company had achieved, and Marcus was reducing them to line items on a budget spreadsheet. Experience has value, I said, working to keep my voice level. There are things you can only learn by working through multiple technology cycles, by seeing how decisions made today affect outcomes 5 years down the road. Marcus's smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor, I'm going to be frank with you. The technology industry is changing rapidly. What mattered 5 years ago might not be relevant today. We need people who understand social media integration, mobile-first development, cloud-native architecture. We need developers who think in terms of microservices and containerization, not monolithic applications. I've been working with cloud architecture since before it was called cloud architecture, I said. I was implementing distributed systems when most of your recent hires were in middle school. And that experience is valuable, he said in a tone that suggested it wasn't. But we also need to consider cultural fit. We're building a dynamic, fast-paced environment. We need team members who can keep up with late-night coding sessions, weekend hackathons, and the kind of intensive collaboration that drives breakthrough innovation. There it was. The implication that older employees couldn't keep up, couldn't adapt, couldn't contribute to the high-energy environment he was trying to create. Never mind that I'd pulled more all-nighters debugging critical systems than most of his recent hires had even heard about. Never mind that I'd been part of teams that had solved problems these new developers couldn't even conceptualize. I think you're making a mistake, I said finally. You're prioritizing enthusiasm over expertise, and that's going to cost the company in ways you can't anticipate. Marcus stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. I appreciate your perspective, Eleanor. Really, I do. But this is the direction we're moving. I hope you can find a way to be part of our future. The dismissal was polite but final. As I walked back to my office, I realized that I'd just been put on notice. Marcus hadn't said it explicitly, but the message was clear. Adapt to his vision, or find yourself among the next round of departures. Over the following weeks, I watched the systematic dismantling of everything that had made Cascade Technologies a place where people wanted to work. Marcus instituted mandatory overtime policies, disguised as flexible scheduling. He introduced competitive ranking systems that pitted team members against each other rather than encouraging collaboration. He brought in consultants who conducted efficiency audits that inevitably recommended eliminating the highest-paid positions in favor of junior alternatives. The breaking point came during a department meeting in early December. Marcus had called together all the senior developers to discuss what he termed a modernization initiative. The conference room was packed with people who had collectively built most of the systems that kept Cascade running, and the tension was palpable as Marcus took his position at the head of the table. I've been doing a comprehensive review of our development practices, he began, pulling up a presentation that I immediately recognized as trouble. And I've identified several areas where we can improve efficiency and innovation. The slides that followed were a systematic critique of everything our team had built over the past decade. Legacy code that needed to be rewritten. Outdated development practices that were slowing down delivery. Architecture decisions that weren't aligned with modern best practices. Each criticism was technically accurate in isolation, but collectively they painted a picture of a development team that was hopelessly behind the times. The solution, Marcus continued, is a comprehensive modernization effort. We're going to rebuild our core systems from the ground up, using cutting-edge frameworks and development methodologies. Robert Martinez raised his hand. Marcus, some of these systems handle millions of transactions daily. A complete rewrite would take years and introduce massive risks to our operations. Which is why we're going to approach this strategically, Marcus replied. We're going to bring in a team of specialist developers, people who live and breathe modern development practices. This team will work alongside our existing developers to ensure knowledge transfer while implementing the new architecture. Sarah Kim leaned forward. Are you talking about contractors? Because our systems require deep institutional knowledge that takes months to develop. Not contractors, Marcus said with a smile that made my blood run cold. New hires. We're going to be adding 12 new developers over the next 6 months, all with cutting-edge skills in the technologies we need to embrace. The math was simple and brutal. 12 new developers, all requiring competitive salaries and benefits. The budget for those positions had to come from somewhere, and Marcus had already made it clear where he intended to find the money. "Where exactly do you plan to put 12 new developers?" I asked. "Our current teams are already at capacity." "That's an excellent question, Eleanor," Marcus said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "We're going to be restructuring our development organization to create a more streamlined and efficient structure." He advanced to the next slide, which showed an organizational chart that was missing about half the names currently in the room. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. Effective January 1st, we'll be implementing a new team structure focused on agile development and rapid iteration. This structure will emphasize flexibility, innovation, and the kind of dynamic thinking that's essential in today's competitive environment. Jennifer Walsh stared at the chart. "Marcus, this shows only 6 senior developers remaining. We currently have 14. "Correct," Marcus said without a trace of discomfort. "We'll be right-sizing our senior positions to focus on oversight and mentoring, while the bulk of our development work will be handled by our new team members." Right-sizing. Corporate euphemism for firing people but making it sound like a strategic decision rather than cost-cutting. "You're talking about eliminating half our senior development staff," Robert said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "These are people who understand our systems better than anyone." "I understand." "This is difficult," Marcus replied, his tone suggesting he understood nothing of the sort. "But we need to make tough decisions to position ourselves for the future. The technology industry doesn't wait for companies that can't adapt." That's when he looked directly at me, his expression carrying a message that was impossible to misinterpret. "This company needs young energy," he said, his voice carrying throughout the silent conference room. "We need developers who think differently, who approach problems with fresh perspectives, who can work with the intensity and creativity that drives real innovation. We need people who are hungry, who are willing to do whatever it takes to succeed." The implication hung in the air like smoke. We were too old, too set in our ways, too expensive, and too comfortable to contribute to his vision of what Cascade should become. Never mind our track record. Never mind our expertise. Never mind the fact that we'd built the very company he was now trying to remake in his image. "When do you need decisions about the new structure?" Sarah asked quietly. "I'll be meeting with each senior developer individually over the next 2 weeks," Marcus said. "We'll discuss role expectations, compensation adjustments, and transition timelines." Translation. He was going to call us in one by one and explain exactly how little he valued our contributions, then offer us the choice between accepting dramatically reduced roles or finding new jobs. As the meeting ended and people filed out in stunned silence, I remained in my chair, staring at the organizational chart that represented the systematic destruction of everything we'd built. Marcus was still packing up his presentation materials when I finally spoke. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," I said. He looked up with that same patient smile. "Eleanor, I know this is hard to accept, but sometimes progress requires difficult choices." "Progress?" I stood up slowly, feeling something shift inside me that I hadn't experienced in years. "You call destroying institutional knowledge progress? You call eliminating the people who actually understand how this company works progress?" "I call adapting to market realities progress," Marcus replied, his tone becoming slightly cooler. "Eleanor, I'm going to be direct with you. Your meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I suggest you use the time between now and then to think carefully about whether you want to be part of our future or whether you'd prefer to explore other opportunities." The threat was barely veiled. Accept whatever diminished role he offered, or join the growing list of former Cascade employees who'd been deemed too old and too expensive for his vision of the company. I walked back to my office in a daze, past cubicles where younger employees were already buzzing with excitement about the promised new hires and the modernization initiative. They saw opportunity where I saw destruction, advancement where I saw the systematic elimination of everything that had made Cascade Technologies successful. That evening, I sat in my home office overlooking Lake Washington, surrounded by awards and commendations from my 23 years with the company. Employee of the Year 2018, Technical Innovation Award 2020. Leadership Excellence Recognition 2022. 2 decades of contributions reduced obstacles in Marcus Thornfield's path to creating his ideal workforce. But as I sat there reviewing the organizational chart and thinking about Marcus's ultimatum, something began to crystallize in my mind. There were things about Cascade Technologies that Marcus didn't know, documents he'd never seen, decisions that had been made long before he arrived that would fundamentally change his understanding of who held the real power in this situation. Tomorrow's meeting was going to be very different from what Marcus expected. And by the time I finished explaining the true structure of Cascade Technologies, his plans for workforce revitalization were going to need some serious revision. The next afternoon, I walked into Marcus Thornfield's office carrying a folder that contained documents he'd never bothered to review during his transition into the CEO role. His assistant Ashley had scheduled me for 30 minutes, which I suspected Marcus thought would be more than enough time to deliver his ultimatum and accept my resignation. He was wrong about that, just as he'd been wrong about so many other things since taking over the company. Marcus was seated behind his standing desk when I entered, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. He gestured toward the same uncomfortable metal chair I'd occupied during our previous meeting, but this time I remained standing. "Eleanor," he said, his tone carrying just the right blend of sympathy and firmness. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss your future with the company." "Actually, Marcus," I said, setting my folder on his desk, "I thought we should discuss your future with the company." Something flickered across his expression, but he maintained his composure. "I'm not sure I understand." "I think you will in a moment," I replied, opening the folder and removing the first document. This is the original incorporation filing for Cascade Technologies, dated March 15, 2001. I'd like you to look at the founding shareholders listed on page 3. Marcus glanced at the document with the dismissive air of someone humoring a delusional employee, but as his eyes scanned the names, his expression began to change. The confident smile faded, replaced by something approaching confusion. "There must be some mistake," he said finally. "No mistake," I said, pulling out another document. "This is the current shareholder registry, updated as of last month. As you can see, the ownership structure has remained remarkably stable over the years." Marcus stared at the papers, his face going pale as he processed what he was reading. According to the documents in front of him, Eleanor Chen owned 60% of Cascade Technologies, with the remaining 40% split between 2 other original co-founders who had maintained their positions as silent partners. "This is impossible," he whispered. "The board of directors hired me. They have authority over the company. The board has authority over daily operations," I corrected. "But major decisions, including leadership changes and strategic direction, require approval from shareholders holding more than 50% of the company. That would be me." I pulled out a third document, this one bearing the letterhead of the law firm that had handled Cascade's corporate structure since the beginning. "This is a legal opinion confirming my authority as majority shareholder to make executive decisions regarding company leadership and strategic direction. It was prepared last week, after I became concerned about the direction you were taking the company." Marcus sank into his chair, the documents scattered across his desk like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed. "But the board said, they told me I had full authority to restructure." "The board," I said patiently, "was operating under the assumption that I would continue to remain a silent partner, as I have for the past 23 years. They weren't wrong to hire you, Marcus. David Morrison recommended you personally, and your credentials are impressive. But they failed to inform you about the ownership structure, and you failed to do your due diligence before beginning your restructuring plans." I watched him struggle to process this information, seeing the exact moment when he realized that every decision he'd made, every employee he'd terminated, every plan he'd implemented, had been done without the knowledge or consent of the person who actually controlled the company. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to see what kind of leader you were," I said simply. "I wanted to understand your vision for the company, your management style, and your values. I needed to know whether you were someone I could trust with the day-to-day operations of a company I had helped build from nothing." The silence stretched between us as Marcus absorbed the implications of what I was telling him. Every conversation we'd had, every dismissive comment about legacy resources and outdated employees, every plan to eliminate experienced staff in favor of cheaper alternatives, had been delivered directly to the person who had the power to end his employment with a single phone call. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I pulled out the final document from my folder, a formal notice that I'd had prepared by our legal team. "Now you have a choice, Marcus. You can resign from your position as CEO, effective immediately, with a generous severance package and a positive reference for your next opportunity. Or you can continue in your role under a modified employment agreement that gives me direct oversight of all major decisions and requires my approval for any personnel changes affecting employees with more than 5 years of tenure." Marcus stared at the resignation letter, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. "This is because of the restructuring plans? This is because you demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes Cascade Technologies successful," I said. "You saw experienced employees as expensive liabilities rather than valuable assets. You prioritized cost-cutting over institutional knowledge. And you did it all, while assuming that you had the authority to destroy what others had spent decades building." I moved to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline, where Cascade Technologies had grown from a 3-person startup into a major player in the enterprise software market. "Do you know what our client retention rate was when David Morrison ran this company? 97%. Do you know why?" Marcus shook his head, still staring at the resignation letter. "Because our clients trusted us to understand their businesses, to solve their problems, and to maintain the systems that kept their operations running smoothly. That trust was built by people like Sarah Kim, who spent 5 years working with Pacific Northwest Bank to design their security protocols. By people like Robert Martinez, who personally managed the system integration when Cascade acquired Morrison's 3 largest competitors. By people like Jennifer Walsh, who has never missed a project deadline in 12 years. I turned back to face Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time since he'd walked into our headquarters 2 months ago. "You looked at those people and saw obstacles to your vision of a young, dynamic workforce. I look at them and see the foundation of everything Cascade has achieved." Marcus finally found his voice. "What about innovation? What about staying competitive in a changing market?" "Innovation doesn't require eliminating experience, Marcus. It requires combining fresh perspectives with institutional knowledge. The best teams I've ever worked with included both recent graduates with cutting-edge technical skills and veterans who understood how to implement those skills in ways that actually solved business problems." I reached for the resignation letter, holding it between us. "You have until 5 o'clock today to make your decision. If you choose to resign, I'll make sure you leave with your reputation intact and resources to find your next opportunity. If you choose to stay under the modified agreement, you'll have the chance to learn what collaborative leadership actually looks like." Marcus looked up at me with something approaching desperation. "And if I stay, what happens to my restructuring plans?" "Your restructuring plans are terminated, effective immediately," I said without hesitation. "Every employee you plan to eliminate will be retained with full compensation and benefits. The 12 new hires you plan to bring in will be reduced to 3, and they'll be hired to supplement our existing teams rather than replace them." I gathered the documents from his desk, leaving only the resignation letter. "You had one thing right, Marcus. This company does need energy, but energy comes from passion, from commitment, from people who care about building something lasting rather than optimizing quarterly performance metrics. That energy exists at every age and every experience level." As I reached the door, Marcus called out behind me, "Eleanor, wait, can I ask you something?" I turned back, seeing him slumped in his chair like a man who'd just watched his entire world shift beneath his feet. "How long have you been the majority owner?" "Since the beginning," I said simply. "I was one of the 3 co-founders who started Cascade Technologies in 2001. David Morrison was the public face of the company, but I've been the primary investor and decision-maker from day one." Marcus stared at me in disbelief. "But you're a developer. You write code. You sit in a cubicle like everyone else." "I write code because I love writing code," I said. "I sit in a cubicle because I prefer working alongside my team rather than isolating myself in an executive office." And I've remained a silent partner because I believe that the best way to build a successful company was to focus on creating great products rather than managing corporate politics. I paused at the doorway, looking back at this man who had so completely misunderstood everything about the company he'd been hired to lead. The decision is yours, Marcus, but I should mention that if you choose to resign, I'll be announcing your departure to the company as a mutual decision to pursue different strategic directions. If you choose to stay under the modified agreement, I'll be announcing my role as majority shareholder and my intention to take a more active role in company operations. The implications were clear: resign quietly and maintain his professional reputation, or stay and have everyone learn that he'd spent 2 months systematically antagonizing the person who actually owned the company. At 4:30 that afternoon, Marcus Thornfield submitted his resignation as CEO of Cascade Technologies. By 5 o'clock, I was sitting in the main conference room with the same senior developers who had listened to his modernization presentation just 24 hours earlier. The mood in the room was dramatically different from our meeting the previous day. Where there had been tension and anxiety, now there was confusion and cautious hope. Word had already begun to spread that Marcus was leaving, but no one understood why or what it meant for the restructuring plans. I know you all have questions, I began, looking around the table at colleagues who had been my teammates for years but had no idea they'd been working alongside the company's owner. And I'm going to answer all of them. But first I need to tell you something that I probably should have shared a long time ago. I stood up, feeling the weight of 23 years of secrecy lifting from my shoulders. My name is Eleanor Chen, and I'm the majority owner of Cascade Technologies. I founded this company in 2001, along with David Morrison and Rebecca Torres, and I've been the primary investor and decision-maker since the beginning. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah Kim's mouth fell open. Robert Martinez looked like he'd been hit with a brick. Jennifer Walsh just stared at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. I know this is a shock, I continued, and I know you're wondering why I never told you. The truth is, I preferred working as part of the team rather than being seen as the boss. I wanted to earn your respect through my contributions, not through my title. Robert finally found his voice. You're saying you own the company? You've been our colleague for 20 years, and you actually own the company? 60% of it, I confirmed. Rebecca Torres owns 20% and remains involved as a silent partner. David Morrison owned 20% until he sold his shares back to me when he retired. Sarah leaned forward. Does this mean the restructuring plans are canceled? Completely canceled, I said firmly. No one is being laid off. No one is being demoted. No one is being asked to accept reduced compensation or responsibilities. The relief in the room was palpable, but I could see that my colleagues were still struggling to process the revelation. Jennifer Walsh spoke up next. Eleanor, why are you telling us this now? Because Marcus Thornfield's approach to leadership made it clear that I could no longer remain a silent partner. When someone threatens to destroy the foundation of the company you've built, you step in to protect it. I walked to the whiteboard and began sketching the organizational structure that Marcus had planned to implement, then drew red lines through the positions he intended to eliminate. Marcus saw you as expensive liabilities, I said, my voice carrying the anger I'd been suppressing for weeks. He looked at your experience and your expertise and decided that 3 recent graduates could replace each of you at a fraction of the cost. The room was completely silent as my colleagues absorbed the full scope of what had almost happened to their careers. But here's what Marcus didn't understand, I continued. Sarah, your security protocols have prevented an estimated $4 million in potential losses from cyber attacks over the past 3 years. Robert, your architecture designs have enabled us to scale our operations by 300% without proportional increases in infrastructure costs. Jennifer, your project management has consistently delivered software ahead of schedule and under budget, giving us a competitive advantage that our clients specifically request when renewing contracts. I turned back to face the room, seeing my colleagues with fresh eyes after months of watching Marcus systematically devalue their contributions. You're not liabilities. You're the reason Cascade Technologies is successful. You're the reason our clients trust us. You're the reason we've maintained profitability even during economic downturns when our competitors were struggling. Robert cleared his throat. What happens now? With Marcus gone, who's going to run the company? I am, I said simply. I'm going to step into the CEO role on an interim basis while we search for someone who understands that experience and innovation work best when they're combined, rather than positioned as competing priorities. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. Eleanor, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why did you stay in development? If you owned the company, why didn't you move into management years ago? It was a question I'd been expecting, and one that got to the heart of why I'd structured my career the way I had. Because I love writing code, I said honestly. I love solving technical problems. I love the satisfaction of building systems that work elegantly and efficiently. Management was never the goal for me. Building great software was the goal. I moved back to my seat at the table, feeling more comfortable in that familiar environment than I ever had in Marcus's sterile office. But I also love this company and the people who work here. And when someone threatens either one of those things, I'll do whatever it takes to protect them. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, shaking her head in amazement. 23 years. You've been here for 23 years and none of us knew. David knew, obviously, and Rebecca has always been involved in major decisions. But otherwise, yes. I preferred it that way. What about the board of directors? Robert asked. Do they know? They're gonna find out tomorrow morning, I said with a slight smile. I've called an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. to discuss the leadership transition and to clarify the ownership structure for any board members who may have forgotten about it. The implications of that statement weren't lost on anyone in the room. The board of directors had hired Marcus and given him authority to restructure the company without consulting the majority shareholder. Tomorrow's meeting was going to be very uncomfortable for several people. I have one more question, Sarah said. The new hires Marcus planned to bring in. What happens to them? We'll still be hiring, I said, but 3 new developers instead of 12, and they'll be joining our teams as junior members, rather than replacing senior staff. We do need fresh perspectives and new skills, but we need them as additions to our expertise, not substitutions for it. As the meeting wound down and my colleagues prepared to return to their normal work, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't experienced in months. The crisis was over. The company was safe. The people who had built Cascade Technologies alongside me would continue to be part of its future. But as I gathered my notes and prepared to return to what would no longer be just another cubicle, I realized that everything had changed. I was no longer Eleanor Chen, the senior developer. I was Eleanor Chen, the CEO, and that transition was going to require adjustments for everyone. The next 6 months would test whether I could successfully combine my technical expertise with the leadership responsibilities I'd avoided for so long. But for the first time since Marcus Thornfield had walked through our doors, I felt confident about the future of Cascade Technologies. We had survived the threat to our culture and our people. Now it was time to show the industry what a technology company could accomplish when it valued both innovation and experience, when it treated employees as assets rather than expenses, and when it was led by someone who understood that the best software is built by teams that respect and support each other. The revolution Marcus had planned for Cascade Technologies was over before it had really begun. The evolution I was planning would take much longer, but it would be built on the foundation of everything that had made us successful, rather than the destruction of everything we'd achieved. The board meeting the next morning was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 23 years at Cascade Technologies. I arrived early, settling into my usual seat at the far end of the polished conference table where I'd attended quarterly updates as a silent observer for over 2 decades. But today I wasn't there as Eleanor Chen, the senior developer. Today I was there as Eleanor Chen, the majority shareholder. And the documents in my briefcase would fundamentally alter how these 7 board members understood their role in the company. Patricia Hendricks, the board chair, called the meeting to order at precisely 9 o'clock. She was a formidable woman in her early 60s who had built her reputation managing corporate restructurings for technology companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. Next to her sat Thomas Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who represented the investment fund that had provided growth capital during our expansion into the California market. The other board members included legal counsel, financial advisors, and industry veterans who had guided Cascade through various challenges over the years. Thank you all for accommodating this emergency session, Patricia began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling corporate boardrooms. As you're aware, Marcus Thornfield submitted his resignation yesterday afternoon, effective immediately. We need to discuss succession planning and determine our next steps for company leadership. She paused, glancing around the table with the expression of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. Marcus cited philosophical differences with company direction as his reason for departing. While this is certainly unexpected, we need to move quickly to ensure operational continuity. I waited as Patricia outlined the board's preliminary thoughts about interim leadership and the search process for a permanent replacement. They discussed Marcus's restructuring plans, which several board members seemed to view favorably despite the abrupt leadership change. Thomas Chen particularly emphasized the need to continue the workforce optimization initiatives that Marcus had begun. The technology sector is becoming increasingly competitive, Thomas said, consulting notes from his previous conversations with Marcus. We can't afford to maintain compensation structures that put us at a disadvantage when competing for contracts. The modernization plans Marcus developed would have positioned us for significant growth. Finally, Patricia turned her attention to me. Eleanor, given your tenure and your technical leadership role, we'd like your perspective on the transition. How do you think the development teams will respond to leadership changes? This was my moment. I reached into my briefcase and removed the folder that contained documents most of these board members hadn't reviewed in years, if they'd ever seen them at all. Before we discuss leadership transition, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. I think we need to clarify something about the company's ownership structure. I placed the first document on the table, sliding it toward Patricia. This is the current shareholder registry for Cascade Technologies, updated as of last week. Patricia glanced at the document with the casual attention of someone expecting routine paperwork, but her expression changed dramatically as she processed what she was reading. The confident composure that had characterized her leadership of the meeting evaporated as she stared at the ownership percentages listed on the page. Eleanor, she said slowly, I think there may be some error in this documentation. No error, I replied, placing additional documents on the table. These are the original incorporation filings from 2001, the partnership agreements that establish the ownership structure, and the legal opinions confirming my authority as majority shareholder. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a corporate setting. Thomas Chen reached for the documents with trembling hands, his face pale as he scanned the legal language that confirmed what Patricia had just read. The other board members leaned forward, craning their necks to see papers that would redefine their understanding of their own authority. This is impossible, Thomas whispered. The board hired Marcus. We conducted the search process. We negotiated his compensation package. The board has authority over operational decisions, I said calmly. But major strategic changes, including leadership appointments and structural reorganizations, require approval from shareholders holding more than 50% of the company. That approval was never requested, and it was never granted. Patricia set the documents down with the careful movements of someone trying to maintain composure while processing shocking information. Eleanor, you're telling us that you've been the majority owner of this company for 23 years, and we've been making decisions without your knowledge or consent? I'm telling you that you've been making operational decisions within your authority, but that Marcus's restructuring plans exceeded that authority and would have required my approval before implementation. I reached for another document, this one bearing the letterhead of Cascade's law firm. This is a formal notice that I prepared yesterday, outlining my intention to exercise direct oversight of strategic decisions moving forward. It also confirms that Marcus Thornfield's employment was terminated at my direction due to his plans to eliminate experienced staff without proper authorization. The board members exchanged glances that ranged from confused to panicked. These were people who prided themselves on their corporate governance expertise, and they were realizing that they'd been operating under fundamental misunderstandings about their own authority. Thomas Chen found his voice first. Eleanor, why didn't you ever tell us? In all these years, why did you let us believe we had autonomous decision-making authority? Because until yesterday, you'd never made decisions that threatened the foundation of the company, I replied. David Morrison understood the ownership structure and made sure that major decisions aligned with my vision for Cascade. The board provided valuable oversight and guidance within that framework. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Elliott Bay, the same view I'd contemplated from Marcus's office just 24 hours earlier. But Marcus's approach represented a fundamental departure from everything that made Cascade successful. He saw our experienced employees as expensive obstacles rather than valuable assets. He planned to eliminate institutional knowledge in favor of cost savings. That required intervention. Patricia cleared her throat uncomfortably. What does this mean for the board moving forward? What's our role if you're exercising direct control over strategic decisions? Your role remains largely the same, I said, returning to my seat. You provide oversight, guidance, and expertise on operational matters. You ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and industry standards. You offer perspective on market conditions and competitive positioning. I gathered the documents back into my folder, leaving copies for each board member to review. What changes is that major decisions affecting company culture, workforce composition, and strategic direction will require my approval. And I'll be taking a more active role in ensuring that those decisions align with the values and principles that built this company. Thomas leaned forward. And what are those values from your perspective? It was a question that got to the heart of everything I'd been fighting to preserve over the past 2 months. Innovation through collaboration rather than competition, I said without hesitation. Respect for experience alongside enthusiasm for new ideas. Investment in people as assets, rather than management of people as expenses. Building sustainable success rather than optimizing short-term metrics. I paused, looking around the table at faces that were still processing the dramatic shift in their understanding of corporate hierarchy. Marcus looked at our senior developers and saw salary costs that could be reduced. I look at those same people and see the expertise that enables us to solve complex problems for clients who trust us with their most critical systems. That's not just a philosophical difference. It's a fundamental disagreement about what makes a technology company valuable. The legal counsel Margaret Walsh spoke up for the first time. Eleanor, from a governance perspective, we need to understand the implications of this change. Are you planning to replace the board? Are you restructuring the corporate management framework? I'm not planning to replace anyone who's willing to work within the proper authority structure, I said. But I am planning to ensure that future decisions are made with full understanding of the ownership hierarchy and with appropriate consultation on strategic matters. Patricia gathered her composure and resumed her role as board chair, though the dynamics of the meeting had shifted irrevocably. What's our immediate priority regarding leadership succession? I'll be serving as interim CEO while we conduct a search for someone who understands how to build on our strengths rather than eliminate them, I said. The search will focus on leaders who have experience growing technology companies through collaboration and innovation rather than cost-cutting and workforce optimization. Thomas Chen looked up from the documents he'd been studying. What about the restructuring plans Marcus developed? Some of those initiatives could have generated significant cost savings. This was the question I'd been expecting, and it gave me the opportunity to address the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to the current crisis. Thomas, let me ask you something, I said. Do you know what our client retention rate has been over the past 5 years? He consulted his notes, clearly unsure where I was heading. Approximately 97%, which is exceptional for the industry. And do you know why our retention rate is so much higher than our competitors? Thomas hesitated. Superior technology? Competitive pricing? Personal relationships, I said firmly. Our clients stay with us because they trust the people who manage their accounts, implement their systems, and solve their problems. Sarah Kim has worked with Pacific Northwest Bank for 8 years. When they have a security concern, they call Sarah directly, because they know she understands their infrastructure better than anyone else. I pulled out my laptop and opened a presentation I'd prepared during the sleepless hours after Marcus's resignation. Robert Martinez personally managed the integration when Cascade acquired Morrison Industries 3 years ago. That acquisition brought us 4 major clients and $12 million in annual revenue. Those clients stayed with us specifically because Robert convinced them that their systems would be maintained by people who understood their business requirements. The board members studied the client relationship data I was displaying, seeing for the first time the direct connection between employee tenure and revenue retention. Marcus's restructuring would have eliminated both Sarah and Robert, along with 6 other senior staff members who manage relationships worth a combined $42 million in annual revenue. The cost savings from replacing them with junior developers would have been approximately $1.8 million per year. The revenue risk from losing even 20% of those client relationships would have been $4 million annually. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment of the board's previous enthusiasm for Marcus's modernization plans. Patricia stared at the spreadsheet showing client relationships mapped to specific employees, many of whom had been targeted for elimination. Why wasn't this analysis presented when Marcus proposed his restructuring? She asked. Because Marcus never requested this analysis, I replied. He made assumptions about the replaceability of senior staff without investigating the client relationships those staff members maintained. He saw salary costs without considering revenue dependencies. Margaret Walsh leaned forward. Eleanor, this suggests that the board approved restructuring plans without sufficient due diligence. That's a serious governance failure. The board approved plans based on information provided by the CEO. I said diplomatically. Marcus presented his recommendations as operational efficiencies without highlighting the client relationship risks. That's why major strategic decisions require input from people who understand the full scope of business operations. I closed my laptop and looked around the table at 7 people who were beginning to understand how close they'd come to approving the systematic destruction of Cascade's competitive advantages. Moving forward, I continued, all workforce decisions affecting employees with more than 3 years of tenure will require detailed analysis of client relationships, project dependencies, and knowledge transfer requirements. No one gets eliminated simply because their salary seems high relative to market alternatives. Thomas Chen set down his pen and looked directly at me. Eleanor, I have to ask. If you felt this strongly about preserving senior staff, why did you let Marcus get as far as he did? Why didn't you intervene earlier? It was a fair question, and one that had kept me awake for most of the night. Because I hoped he would recognize the value of experienced employees once he had time to understand our operations. I said honestly, I believed that someone with his credentials and background would eventually see what made Cascade successful and would modify his approach accordingly. I paused, remembering the meetings where I'd tried to explain the importance of institutional knowledge, only to be dismissed as someone clinging to outdated practices. I also believed that my colleagues deserved the opportunity to demonstrate their value without interference from ownership. I wanted Marcus to evaluate our team based on their contributions, not on my recommendations. Patricia nodded slowly. But he never made that evaluation. He made assumptions instead of evaluations. I corrected. He looked at birth dates and salary figures rather than performance metrics and client feedback. That's when I realized that intervention was necessary. The meeting continued for another hour as board members asked questions about the ownership structure, the transition process, and the implications for their own roles. By the time we adjourned, everyone understood that Cascade Technologies would be operating under a fundamentally different governance model moving forward. But as I gathered my documents and prepared to leave the conference room, Patricia asked one final question that would shape how I approached the next phase of company leadership. Eleanor, what do you want Cascade to become? Not what you want to preserve, but what you want to build? I considered the question carefully, thinking about the company I'd helped found 23 years earlier, and the organization it had become under David Morrison's leadership. I want Cascade to become the place where technology professionals come to do the best work of their careers, I said finally. I want us to be known for solving problems that other companies can't solve, for building systems that other companies can't build, and for maintaining client relationships that other companies can't sustain. I moved toward the door, then turned back to address the full board one more time. And I want us to prove that you don't have to choose between innovation and experience, between growth and stability, between profitability and treating people with respect. The best technology companies do all of those things simultaneously. As I left the boardroom and walked back to the development floor, I realized that the easy part was over. Revealing my ownership and stopping Marcus's destructuring had been dramatic but straightforward. Building the kind of company I just described to the board would require sustained effort, careful planning, and the kind of collaborative leadership I'd been avoiding for 2 decades. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to my cubicle as word spread throughout the company about the leadership change in my new role. Some colleagues were excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. Others were confused about how our working relationships would change, now that they knew I was their ultimate boss rather than their peer. Sarah Kim was among the first to stop by, settling into the empty chair beside my desk with the comfortable familiarity of a 20-year friendship. "So," she said without preamble, "you've been the secret owner of the company this entire time, and none of us had any idea." "That's accurate," I replied, continuing to review the personnel files that Marcus had flagged for termination. "And you let Marcus treat you like any other employee, even when he was basically telling you that you were too old and too expensive to contribute to the company you actually own." "Also accurate." Sarah shook her head in amazement. "Eleanor, I have to ask, what was it like, sitting in those meetings, while he explained why people like us needed to be replaced?" I set down the files and considered her question. "Infuriating," I said honestly, "but also educational. I learned things about Marcus's leadership style and decision-making process that I never would have discovered if he'd known about the ownership structure." Such as his willingness to make major decisions based on incomplete information. His tendency to dismiss concerns from people he perceives as having less authority. His assumption that cost-cutting and innovation are the same thing. I pulled out the organizational chart that Marcus had presented just 2 days earlier, the one that showed half our senior development positions eliminated. If I'd revealed my ownership immediately, Marcus would have told me what he thought I wanted to hear. By maintaining my cover, I got to see what he actually believed about building successful technology teams. Sarah studied the chart, shaking her head at the scope of the planned eliminations. "Do you think he would have changed his approach if you'd tried to work with him differently?" "I tried to work with him," I reminded her. "I requested meetings. I explained the value of institutional knowledge. I provided examples of how experienced employees contributed to client relationships and project success. He dismissed every concern as resistance to change." I reached for another document, this one showing the client relationship analysis I'd presented to the board that morning. Marcus saw our team as interchangeable resources rather than individual professionals with unique expertise and relationships. That's not a perspective that changes easily, especially when it's reinforced by business school theories about workforce optimization. Jennifer Walsh appeared at my cubicle entrance, holding a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Eleanor," she said, settling into another chair, "I just heard about the board meeting. Is it true that you basically fired Marcus and took over as CEO?" "Marcus resigned," I corrected, "and I'm serving as interim CEO while we search for permanent leadership." "But you could stay in the role permanently if you wanted to?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since Marcus's departure. Did I want to transition from technical contributor to corporate executive? Did I want to trade coding and problem-solving for meetings and strategic planning? "I could," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure that's the best use of my skills or the best decision for the company." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I became majority owner because I wanted to build great software and create an environment where other people could build great software too. Running a $200 million company requires different skills than writing elegant code or designing efficient systems." I gestured toward the executive offices where Marcus had spent his brief tenure. David Morrison was a natural leader who understood how to inspire people and coordinate complex organizational efforts. Marcus was a strategic thinker who understood market dynamics and growth optimization. I'm a technical problem solver who understands how to build systems that work reliably and efficiently. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you don't think you can learn management skills?" "I'm saying I need to be honest about where I can add the most value," I replied. "Maybe that's as CEO. Maybe it's as Chief Technology Officer working with a CEO who shares our values. Maybe it's in some hybrid role that doesn't exist yet." The conversation was interrupted by Robert Martinez, who approached with the kind of nervous energy that suggested important news. "Eleanor," he said, "I just got off a call with Microsoft. They want to discuss a potential partnership for cloud infrastructure development. The project scope is bigger than anything we've handled before." I looked up from the personnel files, immediately interested. "How much bigger?" 18-month timeline, $40 million budget, Integration with their enterprise platform suite. They specifically requested Cascade because of our track record with complex system integrations. Sarah whistled softly. That's huge. That's company-changing, huge. It's also exactly the kind of opportunity that requires our most experienced people, I said, understanding immediately why Robert had brought this directly to me. Microsoft doesn't hand out $40 million contracts to companies that can't demonstrate deep expertise and proven delivery capabilities. Jennifer nodded. If Marcus had eliminated half our senior staff, we never would have qualified for consideration. Which raises an interesting question, Robert said. Do we tell Microsoft about the leadership transition? Do we explain that the team they want to work with is still intact? I considered the implications. Microsoft's decision to approach Cascade was based on our reputation and our demonstrated capabilities. They trusted us to handle complex integration work because they knew our team had successfully managed similar projects for other enterprise clients. We tell them that Cascade remains committed to the same quality standards and technical expertise that made us attractive partners in the first place, I said. We emphasize that our core development team is stable and that our approach to client relationships hasn't changed. I turned to my computer and began pulling up project histories and team assignments. Robert, I want you to prepare a presentation that shows exactly which team members would be involved in the Microsoft project and what their track record is on similar initiatives. Make it clear that these are people with deep experience in enterprise integration work. Are you thinking about this as a way to demonstrate the value of our senior staff? Sarah asked. I'm thinking about this as an opportunity to show what Cascade can accomplish when we focus on building capabilities rather than cutting costs, I replied. If we can successfully deliver a $40 million project for Microsoft, it validates everything I've been saying about the importance of experience and institutional knowledge. Jennifer leaned back in her chair. It also gives you credibility as CEO. Successfully managing a project of that scope while transitioning leadership would be a pretty impressive achievement. The observation was accurate, though I hadn't been thinking about the project in terms of my own leadership credentials. But as I considered the broader implications, I realized that the Microsoft opportunity represented something more significant than a single contract. This project could be a proof of concept for the kind of company I want Cascade to become, I said slowly. High-value, complex work that requires deep expertise in collaborative problem-solving. The kind of projects that justify investing in experienced people rather than replacing them with cheaper alternatives. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard that occupied one wall of our shared workspace, beginning to sketch the project timeline and resource requirements. If we can demonstrate that our approach delivers superior results for clients like Microsoft, it becomes much easier to attract similar opportunities. And if we can build a reputation for handling projects that other companies can't manage, we create a sustainable competitive advantage that doesn't depend on being the lowest cost provider. Robert joined me at the whiteboard, adding technical details about the integration requirements. The timeline is aggressive but manageable if we can dedicate our most experienced people to the project. Microsoft specifically mentioned wanting to work with senior architects who understand enterprise-scale challenges. Which brings us back to the fundamental question Marcus never answered, Sarah said. How do you balance the need for experienced leadership with the benefits of fresh perspectives and new ideas? I turned back to face my colleagues, feeling the excitement that always came with tackling complex technical challenges. You structure teams that combine both, I said. Senior architects who understand the big picture working with junior developers who bring new approaches to implementation. Project managers who know how to navigate client relationships paired with recent graduates who understand cutting-edge tools and methodologies. I began sketching team structures on the whiteboard, showing how different experience levels could complement each other rather than compete for the same roles. The Microsoft project gives us the perfect opportunity to test this approach. We can build teams that leverage institutional knowledge while incorporating innovative techniques. We can demonstrate that diversity of experience leads to better solutions than homogeneous teams at any experience level. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. And if it works, you have a model for how to grow the company without eliminating the people who built it. Exactly, I said. Growth through addition rather than replacement. Innovation through collaboration rather than disruption. As my colleagues returned to their work, I remained at the whiteboard, staring at the team structures I'd sketched and thinking about the conversation with the board of directors that morning. Patricia had asked what I wanted Cascade to become, and I'd given her an answer about solving complex problems and maintaining client relationships. But looking at the whiteboard, I realized that my vision was actually more specific than that. I wanted Cascade to become proof that technology companies could succeed by valuing people rather than viewing them as interchangeable resources. I wanted us to demonstrate that the best innovation came from combining experience with enthusiasm, not from choosing one over the other. The Microsoft project would be our first opportunity to test that theory on a scale that would attract industry attention. If we could successfully deliver a $40 million integration, while maintaining our collaborative culture and our commitment to employee development, it would validate everything I'd been fighting to preserve. But success would require more than just good intentions and technical expertise. It would require the kind of leadership skills I'd been avoiding for 23 years. The ability to coordinate complex teams and manage competing priorities while maintaining the values that made Cascade worth preserving. As I gathered my notes and prepared to spend the evening reviewing project requirements and team capabilities, I realized that I was no longer just the majority owner of Cascade Technologies. I was no longer just the interim CEO appointed to clean up Marcus Thornfield's mistakes. I was becoming the leader of a company that would either prove that experience and innovation could coexist, or that would serve as another example of why the technology industry valued youth over wisdom. The next 18 months would determine not just the success of the Microsoft project, but the future of every employee who had trusted me to protect what we'd built together. The revolution Marcus had planned was over. The evolution I was planning was just beginning. 18 months later, I stood in the main conference room of Cascade Technologies, watching our team present the final deliverables of the Microsoft integration project to a room full of executives who had flown in from Redmond specifically to witness what they were calling a breakthrough in enterprise cloud architecture. The presentation was being led by Sarah Kim and Robert Martinez, with contributions from 3 junior developers who had been hired specifically for this project and had grown into invaluable team members under their mentorship. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. In those first weeks after Marcus's departure, I'd struggled to balance my technical instincts with the leadership responsibilities that came with running a company. There were moments when I questioned whether I should have remained in the background, hiring another CEO, and returning to my comfortable role as a senior developer. But watching Sarah explain the security protocols she'd designed for Microsoft's enterprise clients, seeing the confidence in her voice as she fielded complex technical questions from some of the industry's most demanding executives, I knew that every difficult decision had been worth making. The Microsoft project had become more than just a $40 million contract. It had become a laboratory for testing whether experienced professionals and recent graduates could collaborate to produce results that neither group could achieve alone. The security framework that Sarah had architected was enhanced by machine learning algorithms developed by Marcus Kim, a 25-year-old data scientist we'd hired 6 months into the project. The system integration protocols that Robert had designed were implemented using containerization technologies that Jennifer Torres, a recent graduate from Carnegie Mellon, had proposed during one of our weekly innovation sessions. The most impressive aspect of this implementation, said Dr. Amanda Foster, Microsoft's Vice President of Enterprise Solutions, isn't just the technical excellence, though that's certainly remarkable. It's the seamless integration of cutting-edge methodologies with proven architectural principles. You've created something that's both innovative and reliable, which is rare in enterprise software development. I exchanged glances with Patricia Hendricks, who had remained as board chair and had become one of my most valuable advisors during the transition to permanent CEO. The compliment from Dr. Foster was exactly what we'd hoped to hear. Validation that our approach to combining experience with innovation was producing measurable results. The presentation continued with demonstrations of the system's performance under various load conditions, its security protocols under simulated attack scenarios, and its integration capabilities with existing Microsoft enterprise tools. Each demonstration showcased not just technical achievement, but the collaborative process that had made those achievements possible. When Marcus Kim explained how his machine learning algorithms had been refined through consultation with Sarah's security expertise, he wasn't just describing technical implementation. He was describing a mentorship relationship that had enhanced both participants' capabilities. When Jennifer Torres demonstrated the containerization framework she'd developed, she acknowledged how Robert's guidance had helped her understand enterprise-scale reliability requirements that weren't taught in academic computer science programs. "We'd like to discuss expansion opportunities," Dr. Foster said as the formal presentation concluded. "Based on what we've seen today, Microsoft is interested in partnering with Cascade on 3 additional projects over the next 2 years. The combined value would be approximately $120 million. The figure hung in the air like a validation of everything we'd fought to preserve. When Marcus Thornfield had planned his restructuring 18 months earlier, he'd projected cost savings of $8 million annually from eliminating senior staff. The Microsoft partnership alone would generate revenues that dwarfed those savings by a factor of more than 30. But the financial success, while gratifying, wasn't the most important outcome of the past year and a half. The most important outcome was sitting around the conference table, in the form of a development team that had grown stronger rather than smaller, more capable rather than less expensive, more innovative rather than more standardized. After the Microsoft executives departed and our team had celebrated with champagne and pizza in the break room, I found myself alone in my office, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The office itself was symbolic of the changes we'd implemented. Unlike Marcus's sterile executive suite, I'd chosen a space that was part workspace and part collaboration area, with a standing desk for administrative work and a comfortable seating area where team members could drop by for informal discussions. The walls were covered with whiteboards that displayed current project architectures, team assignments, and strategic planning notes. Unlike the abstract art that Marcus had preferred, my office featured framed photographs of Cascade teams at various project milestones, award ceremonies, and company events. These were reminders that technology companies weren't built by organizational charts and budget spreadsheets, but by people working together to solve complex problems. Sarah Kim knocked on my open door frame holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just successfully defended 18 months of intensive work in front of one of the industry's most demanding audiences. "Room for one more celebration?" she asked, settling into one of the chairs facing my desk. "Always," I replied, accepting the coffee and gesturing toward the whiteboards where we'd mapped out the Microsoft project timeline over a year earlier. "Hard to believe we're actually finished." "Finished with Phase 1, Sarah corrected. "If we accept their expansion proposal, we're looking at 2 more years of collaboration." I nodded, though I was already thinking beyond the immediate Microsoft opportunity. The success of this project had attracted attention from other enterprise clients who were interested in Cascade's approach to complex system integration. Our reputation for combining technical innovation with reliable delivery was generating inquiries that would have been impossible to handle with Marcus's reduced workforce. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, settling back in her chair with the comfortable familiarity of a colleague who had become a close advisor over the past 18 months. "Of course. Do you ever regret not revealing your ownership earlier? Do you wonder what might have happened if you'd intervened before Marcus got as far as he did?" It was a question I'd been asking myself regularly, particularly during the more challenging moments of the transition period. There had been weeks when learning to balance technical leadership with corporate management had felt overwhelming, when I'd questioned whether I was the right person to guide Cascade's growth. "I regret that people had to endure months of uncertainty and disrespect," I said honestly. "I regret that Marcus's approach created anxiety and undermined morale for dedicated employees who didn't deserve that treatment." I paused, considering the broader implications of Sarah's question. "But I don't regret the experience of seeing how someone with Marcus's background and perspective evaluated our team. It taught me things about leadership and organizational culture that I wouldn't have learned any other way." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "Such as the importance of making values explicit rather than assuming they're understood. David Morrison led the company for 15 years based on principles that everyone seemed to share, but those principles were never formally articulated or institutionalized. When Marcus arrived with different values, there was no framework for evaluating whether his approach aligned with Cascade's identity. I stood up and walked to one of the whiteboards, where I'd sketched out the cultural principles that now guided our hiring and promotion decisions. Collaboration over competition, innovation through diversity of experience, investment in people as long-term assets, sustainable growth over short-term optimization. Marcus wasn't necessarily wrong to focus on efficiency and cost management, I continued. Those are legitimate business concerns, but he approached them in ways that undermined the collaborative relationships and institutional knowledge that made efficiency possible in the first place. Sarah joined me at the whiteboard, studying the principles we'd developed through months of team discussions and strategic planning sessions. Do you think we would have been able to articulate these values if Marcus hadn't forced us to defend them? It was an insightful question that got to the heart of organizational development. Probably not, I admitted. When things are working well, it's easy to take the underlying culture for granted. Crisis forces clarity. I moved to the window overlooking Elliott Bay, where the late afternoon sun was reflecting off the water in patterns that reminded me of the code architectures I'd spent decades designing. The Microsoft project succeeded because we had a clear vision of what we were trying to prove. We weren't just delivering a technical solution. We were demonstrating that collaborative teams produce better results than hierarchical teams, that experience and innovation enhance each other rather than competing. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. And now we have the track record to support that philosophy when we hire our next batch of team members. The hiring process had indeed been transformed by our experience with the Microsoft project. Instead of Marcus's focus on individual credentials and cost optimization, we now evaluated candidates based on their ability to contribute to collaborative problem-solving and their willingness to both mentor and learn from colleagues at different experience levels. Our recent hires included seasoned professionals who were looking for environments where their expertise would be valued, recent graduates who were attracted to mentorship opportunities and challenging technical problems, and mid-career developers who wanted to work on projects that combined cutting-edge technology with real-world business impact. Speaking of hiring, Sarah said, returning to her chair, "Have you made a decision about the CTO position?" The question touched on one of the most significant organizational changes we'd implemented during the Microsoft project. As Cascade grew and took on more complex contracts, it became clear that we needed formal technical leadership that could coordinate across multiple project teams while maintaining our collaborative culture. "I've been thinking about it," I said, though the truth was more complicated. Several board members had suggested that I should transition from CEO to CTO, focusing on technical strategy while hiring someone else to handle the administrative and financial aspects of running the company. The idea was appealing in many ways, as it would allow me to return to the technical work I loved while maintaining influence over the company's strategic direction. But the past 18 months had taught me that leadership wasn't just about technical expertise or strategic vision. It was about creating environments where talented people could do their best work, about making decisions that balanced multiple competing priorities, about taking responsibility for outcomes that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in client commitments. "I think," I said slowly, "that the traditional separation between technical and business leadership might not be the right model for Cascade. Our success comes from integrating technical excellence with business strategy, not from treating them as separate domains." Sarah leaned forward with interest. "Are you talking about staying as CEO but maintaining hands-on technical involvement?" "I'm talking about evolving the role to match our company's needs rather than conforming to conventional organizational structures," I replied. "Microsoft chose to work with us because they trusted our technical judgment and our business execution. Those capabilities are connected, not separate." The conversation was interrupted by Robert Martinez, who appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone bearing important news. "Eleanor," he said, "I just received a call from Amazon Web Services. They want to discuss a potential partnership for developing next-generation database optimization tools. The preliminary scope is even larger than the Microsoft project." I looked up from my notes, immediately intrigued. "How much larger?" 3-year timeline, estimated budget of $200 million, with potential for expansion into international markets. They specifically mentioned wanting to work with Cascade because of our reputation for combining technical innovation with enterprise-scale reliability. Sarah whistled softly. That's not just a project. That's a transformation of the entire company. It's also validation that our approach is attracting exactly the kind of opportunities we hoped to pursue, I said, understanding immediately that this represented far more than a single contract. I moved back to the whiteboard and began sketching the resource requirements that a project of this scope would demand. Robert, do we have the team capacity to handle something this significant while maintaining our existing commitments? Not with our current staffing levels, he replied honestly. We'd need to expand by approximately 40% over the next year, with careful attention to maintaining our collaborative culture and technical standards. The challenge was both exciting and daunting. Growing from 180 employees to over 250 while preserving the values and relationships that made Cascade effective would require the kind of thoughtful expansion that Marcus's approach had specifically. Rejected. What's our timeline for responding to Amazon? I asked. They want a preliminary proposal within 6 weeks, with detailed technical specifications and team assignments. If we're selected, the formal contract negotiations would begin in early fall. I turned to Sarah and Robert, seeing in their expressions the same mixture of excitement and determination that had characterized our approach to the Microsoft project. Are we ready for this? The question isn't whether we're ready, Sarah said. The question is whether we can grow responsibly while maintaining the standards that attracted Amazon's attention in the first place. It was exactly the right framing for the challenge ahead. Success wouldn't be measured simply by winning the contract or delivering the technical requirements. Success would be measured by our ability to scale our collaborative approach, to integrate new team members without diluting our culture, and to demonstrate that technology companies could grow through investment in people rather than optimization of resources. Over the following weeks, we developed a comprehensive expansion plan that addressed not just the technical requirements of the Amazon project, but the organizational and cultural challenges of rapid growth. We created mentorship programs that paired experienced developers with new hires. We established technical standards that ensured consistency across project teams while encouraging innovation within those frameworks. We designed compensation structures that rewarded both individual excellence and collaborative contribution. Most importantly, we institutionalized the decision-making processes that had evolved during the Microsoft project. Major technical decisions required input from both senior architects and implementation teams. Hiring decisions emphasized cultural fit alongside technical capabilities. Project assignments balanced skill development opportunities with delivery requirements. The Amazon proposal became a comprehensive demonstration of everything we'd learned about building effective technology teams. Instead of simply responding to their technical specifications, we presented a partnership model that emphasized collaborative development, knowledge transfer, and sustainable innovation practices. When we received confirmation that Amazon had selected Cascade as their development partner, the announcement came with a letter from their Chief Technology Officer that perfectly captured what we'd been working to achieve. Cascade Technologies has demonstrated a unique ability to combine cutting-edge technical capabilities with mature business practices, the letter read. Your team's approach to collaborative development and knowledge management represents exactly the kind of partnership we need for our most challenging initiatives. We're excited to work with an organization that values both innovation and reliability. The celebration that followed was different from the quiet satisfaction we'd felt at the conclusion of the Microsoft project. This was recognition that Cascade had become something larger than a successful regional software company. We had become a demonstration that technology organizations could succeed by investing in people, by combining experience with enthusiasm, and by treating growth as an opportunity to strengthen rather than optimize our foundational capabilities. As I stood in our main conference room, surrounded by colleagues who had survived Marcus Thornfield's restructuring plans and new team members who had joined our expanded organization, I realized that we had accomplished something that went beyond business success. We had proved that technology companies didn't have to choose between innovation and experience, between growth and stability, between profitability and treating people with dignity. The journey from that Christmas Eve confrontation with Marcus to this moment of industry recognition had required difficult decisions, uncomfortable conversations, and the kind of sustained leadership effort I'd spent decades avoiding. But It had also demonstrated that values-based leadership could produce both financial success and personal satisfaction for everyone involved. Sarah Kim approached me as the celebration began to wind down, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the expression of someone reflecting on a complex journey. "So," she said, offering me one of the glasses, "any regrets about stepping out of the shadows and taking control of the company?" I considered her question while looking around the room at the faces of people who had trusted me to protect what we'd built together and to guide its evolution into something even better. "None," I said finally. "This is what Cascade was always meant to become. We just needed someone willing to fight for it." The transformation was complete, but the evolution was just beginning. With the Amazon partnership and the reputation we'd built through the Microsoft project, Cascade Technologies was positioned to become a leader in enterprise software development. Known not just for technical excellence, but for the collaborative culture that made that excellence possible. Marcus Thornfield had been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. The company did need energy. It just wasn't the kind of energy that came from eliminating experience in favor of enthusiasm. It was the kind of energy that came from combining the wisdom of veterans with the passion of newcomers, from treating every team member as an investment rather than an expense, and from building something that would last rather than optimizing something for short-term gain. As I walked back to my office, past cubicles where experienced developers worked alongside recent graduates on problems that neither group could solve alone, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've done something important and done it well. We had saved more than jobs or careers. We had saved an approach to technology development that valued people as much as profits, that prioritized sustainable success over immediate optimization, and that proved that the best innovation comes from collaboration rather than competition. The revolution Marcus had planned would have destroyed all of that. The evolution we had implemented had strengthened it, creating a model that other technology companies were already beginning to study and emulate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new decisions about how to grow while preserving what made us valuable. But tonight I was content to know that Cascade Technologies had become proof that experience and innovation could coexist, that growth and stability could enhance each other, and that treating people with respect was not just morally right but strategically smart. The future belonged to companies that understood those lessons, and Cascade Technologies was ready to lead the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.